Welcome to the Banister Fletcher panel conversation. My name is Min Kyung Lee. I'm the Banister Fletcher Fellow for this year. I'm also assistant professor at Bryn College in the Growth and Structure of Cities department. We have convened today a just amazing group of scholars and thinkers, and I have to say I've been looking forward to this I feel like for years in a way, because I know all of your work. I've read it, and I'm so delighted that you have joined us. So before we begin the conversation, I just wanted to go over a little bit about the format and also how the interaction is going to work. So the format of this conversation is going to follow three different prompts. I'll explain what those are in a minute. And what we're going to do is have the panelists respond to those prompts, and we'll have first a conversation at least amongst ourselves. At any point, if you have a comment or a question, please type that into the chat box that you see on the right. If you want to speak your question, you just put audio, please, and at a certain point we'll allow, Eric, who is the technical support for the programming today, will turn on the audio for that. But you can just simply type it, and then we'll interject those comments into the conversation. Let me pull up what those three prompts are going to be. So we have three different topics that we're going to consider. The first is a topic about actually how do we go about translating qualities into quantities. The second concerns the politics of neutrality, so how numbers actually and maps are not neutral. We know that, but how does that actually work? What exactly are the agendas? How do they get manifested or not, etc. And then the third is about trust and authority. So how do these representations gain our trust, and how are they empowered for policies, etc. Okay, so what I'd like to do is introduce all of you to our panelists, and then we'll start right away with the conversation. I'm going to run through the bios briefly and alphabetically. If you want to know more about any of these panelists, we've hyperlinked everyone's bio pages to the ULIP website, so please go to that. I'm going to start with Bernie Gagan. I've known Bernie since grad school, so I'm really happy that we have a way to interact now. Bernie is a media theorist and a historian of science teaching at King's College, London. I know that his work has always been about investigating the politics of media and methods of communication. And also, I think the cultural and social agendas to technologies. He has a forthcoming book that's titled From Information Technology to French Theory, and it concerns the mutual production of screens and environments. He looks at radar, cinema, phantasmagoria, and global positioning systems. Anne Godluska is an incredibly important scholar to me, but not just to me, but also to the fields of geography and the history of science. Her work has really shaped those disciplines. Her early work investigated French mapping practices in Egypt in the late 18th century, and it really significantly kind of analyzed the ways in which geography as a practice was really fundamentally tied to colonial and imperial investments and concepts. Her current work is an extension of that, and the power of maps, and it relates to ongoing struggles of native populations in Canada to negotiate their representations and knowledge systems. Ijlal Muzaffar is an architectural historian. He has written on the meanings of modernism in the global south. His work addresses the politics that undergird modern and contemporary even planning practices and policies, and how developmental discourses from governments and NGOs, often obscure economic and military aims. He has a forthcoming book that we're all eagerly awaiting, The Periphery Within, Modern Architecture and the Making of the Third World. Jason Bryn is also an architectural historian. He teaches at the University of Toronto. He has a manuscript right now on theory and expertise, the art of building in old regime France. And it's on early modern French architecture and how architects understood their work in terms of both, mechanical philosophy and also in terms of, how they were understanding what expertise meant. And the significance of this particular historic moment in the 18th century is really how architecture was a crucial site where notions about civil society were being negotiated. He also has many other amazing research programs, but this is the one that we're going to focus on today. Caitlin Rosenthal is a historian, and she has a required reading book, which is called Accounting for Slavery, Masters in Management. And it's deservedly won numerous awards and honors. But I think what's really compelling about the work is she tells this story about how the formation of business practices, right? Business practices that we still have, right, and work from, the formation of those business practices on slave plantations. And she reveals the ways in which numbers were produced, not only for economic, but for social and political purposes. So she weaves together this amazing history of capitalism with the history of data practices, and tells in very amazing detailed ways how people have been counted and represented and also not. Jackie Wernemont, she is the Distinguished Chair of Digital Humanities and Social Engagement. I love that there's a chair for that. It's and Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Dartmouth College. She has a recent and incredibly compelling, engrossing book called Numbered Lives, Life and Death in Quantum Media. And it illuminates how we actually count life and death in Britain and the US. It looks at media like the pedometer and mortality tables. It represents, I think for me, what is really important about that work is that it represents a body of research that presents the embodied and material context of quantification. But these are not just numbers that come out of nowhere, but they really were they were attached to particular bodies. So I've put a selected bibliography on the ULIP website, the programming, and it has the citations of all the speakers' work and also other sources. I have to admit the bibliography is like a little bit all over the place because this topic is just huge. So I just picked some of my own favorites. So that's up. And if there's nothing else anyone wants to add specifically, if I miss something important, I'd just like to go ahead and start with that very first prompt, right? Okay, so the whole topic is the messy practice of translating qualities into quantities. And the question that I'm asking in this is how exactly are numbers assigned? Right? What gets counted? What is the material and laborious process of mensuration, quantification? And okay, so that's one part. But I have another part that's aligned, and I'm going to bring it up now, which is that how do visual representations of numbers, right, through tables, maps, plans, all sorts of media, right, how do they conceal the contingent and complicated processes of their very making? Because I don't think that we can talk about how these numbers are assigned without also talking about the media in which they're delivered. Right there, I think those two things are really embedded. So I want to start with Jackie, your work. And I want to take one small quote from your book, Numbered Lives, because to me it's such a beautiful, simple statement. And so you write, there are no data, tracking opportunities, algorithms, or patterns without bodies. right? It's as simple as that. It's complicated, the story that you tell. So one basic question that I would like to begin with, from your book and from your work in general, is how are deaths counted, and how is mobility quantified? And it brings us to the answer that you give in your book is really ontological, right? How these things are counted is an ontological question. So, for example, your book uses this example of the Iraq body count, right at the beginning, the Iraq body count database. And it's the database, you go into it saying that the death has to be confirmed by 2 different sources before it's even counted. And it's, to me, when I read that, it's like the perverse counterpoint of the system in Gogol's Dead Souls. I was thinking like it's the opposite in a perverse way. So can you talk about this, right? What is tracked? How is it tracked, not only for body counts, but mobility?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously it's a question that I love thinking about, even if it sounds slightly morbid to think about, like how and why we count both our dead and also the activities of the living. And one of the things in the mortality counts that I found so interesting as I was doing the research, right, is that there's an enormous amount of labor that goes into counting, right? But, and this gestures a little bit towards your future questions about expertise and stuff, that information gets filtered up from people who are considered non-experts, and yet somehow the people on the ground, right, best able to judge a death, and it gets filtered up through sort of like layers of bureaucracy. And this starts in the 17th century, right, where you've got searching women who are wards of the church, essentially, often widows, who need help coming up with the basic necessities of life. And so they're wards of the church. They then get tasked to go out and identify the cause of death for bodies, as literally, right, the plague is sort of littering the streets of London with dead bodies. And so these women undertake enormous personal risk, right, to come into proximity, close proximity of a body that has possibly died from the plague, in order to decide, right, this is a death from cardiac arrest, this is a death from old age, this is a death from bad teeth, or this is a death from the plague. And they presented those death counts on little sheets of paper, little square sheets of paper. We have just a handful of them in the archives. They give them to the parish clerks. Parish clerks are men who are associated with the particular parish of the Church of England, assigned with some of the record keeping. It then filters up through that organization, and then to the mayor of London, and then to the king and or queen of England, right? And so in the process of that layered bureaucracy, there's also multiple layers of remediation, right? Where it goes from that little sheet of paper written by a woman into, right, these aggregated tables where you see none of that labor. You see none of the reality of the physical body, its gender, its race, its condition, any of those things. And it sort of just then becomes a matter of paperwork in many ways. And I think, you know, there's a way in which this moving from the matter of the body to a body of paperwork is a kind of interesting trajectory that I see us moving through. And that has continued to be the case through history. It takes different forms, right? And I know Caitlin's work is partly on this, and others who are working on the history of slavery, right? The transformation of a body from a human body in its sort of three-dimensional fullness into something like, a number in a table or an insurance figure. And that's, again, a kind of remediation. And when we talk about tracking human life, the first pedometers were used actually not to count steps, but to measure distance, right? So they were originally part of map making, which ties in really nicely, I think, to this, this panel on measuring and map making. And it wasn't until, roughly the time of Napoleon that you begin to get the quantification of steps for the purposes of judging health, right? And yet we still have this kind of like taking human steps and turning them into measurements that get turned into maps that get placed into books that are part of the colonial empire, right? So that these sort of going from the messy work of the body into this sort of body of paperwork, I think is something that we've seen over time. And I think it's it's a technology of control, that process is, right? It's a technology of control, and it's one in which gendered and raced power is expressed, right? So you've got a situation in which women are very early on erased from those record books. You have situations in which people of African descent are literally losing their humanity and becoming numbers, right? But you also have a range of different bodies, of course, across the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, even here in the United States, that are being transformed in this kind of administrative assertion of power, right? That says, we will take the things that you do with your body and we will transform them into numbers that are meaningful to the state. And that's what the state will keep. It's not concerned so much with the control or keeping the body itself, right? And that's a whole interesting other thing. I'm thinking of a kind of necropolitical context. But the biopolitical context says we very much want to remediate away from the messiness of the body into the cleanness of a table or an account or a receipt. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah, it's great that I love that phrasing that you have the messiness of the body to the cleanness of paperwork. I think Caitlin's book actually shows us how messy that paperwork tends to be. That it has this allure of seeming to be organized and clear, but it ends up not. And so I want to actually turn to your work, Caitlin, also because it relates very well to Caitlin's attention to labor. I mean, can you talk about the ways in which these numbers were organized, conditioned by the paper media? I mean, in your case, these actual account books.
So this is, so many things have already been said that I feel like I want to give you like 7 different examples. But I'm gonna defer back to the one that I wanted to talk about before we even got started, which is thinking about one kind of mediation and how numbers are helping at multiple phases of that mediation. And the thing that I'm thinking about is a set of records of how people are being priced. So how you're attaching a number, and this number is a value on a person, and not even just a value, because there's lots of times people are being valued, but a price for being sold in a market. And I think that's a particularly useful one for this kind of getting away from, like, getting to the paper trail, because we have this, this idea about an invisible hand in a market, and prices are just supposed to come out of that market, right? They're pretending to be invisible all the time. And you go to look at these plantation records and slave traders records, and you can see the labor that goes into that. And so the record that I'm thinking of is a advertisement for auctions. And this advertisement for auctions divides people into categories. There are prime, and they use the language of futures markets. Prime meaning like a hardy, hardworking person who's 20 to 35 years old or so. Prime age men and women, though they call the women girls, and rated prime first and second categories. And then the thing that I think is especially fascinating is how they rate the children who are also being offered for sale. And so they have categories, and each of the categories is offered by height. And this at first struck me as so strange. Like, why would you price someone by height? It's an utterly ridiculous way. If children, like age would be much more valuable. And the best the best answer that I've been able to come to is that height is a way to cut the enslaved person out of the negotiation. We know from work on the history of slavery that enslaved people, when they are being sold, they are the most vulnerable party, of course, and they're trying to influence the sale in any way they can. If they think someone is a good potential master, they want to encourage the sale, or they want to stay with their family, keep their children with them. So they're trying to influence sale. And what is an age? In this moment, an age is something on which an enslaved person might have better knowledge than either buyer or seller. And by contrast, height is something that either of them, the buyer and the seller, can kind of externally verify, and they can come to an agreement for sale, and then that enslaved person can't interject themselves to influence it. Now, they can interject themselves and shape the sale in all kinds of other ways, but this is a moment where another set of numbers that look very neutral let you get to this thing called price, which is incredibly subjective. And they let them get there in a way that cuts this third party, the person being sold, out of the negotiation. And there's so many other ways. Like listening to Jackie, I was thinking of how, enslaved people are often themselves involved in the record keeping themselves. They're not allowed to be taught to do arithmetic, and yet they have to have all these arithmetic quantitative skills to do this. So they're, slavery, when it's working its most efficiently from the perspective of enslavers, is using people as this kind of highly skilled human capital that sometimes even knows how to quantify, and yet cutting them out of all these kinds of negotiations.
I think that's such a moving, way to talk about how this process was about dehumanizing people, right, and objectifying them, but it was on the level of not being able to allow for any social relationship, right? That was the way in which that dehumanizing process worked. One other thing that I always found so haunting in your book was when you show these images of these accounting tables with slaves next to livestock, right? Where, and for me, I was wondering if you could talk about your interpretation of that, of those two things being put together.
So one of the sets of materials I work with for people who don't know my work is these kind of blank forms. And people fill in the blank forms in order to keep data in a more organized way. And it also allows a kind of rolling up of the information, in a sense, like a British planter who owns multiple Caribbean plantations could get an identical form back for each, and then they could compare. And one of the characteristics of these is that the records for livestock look nearly identical, except for the categories, to the records for people. And it's an interesting, it first of all shows that they're thinking about people in this very reductive way, where you can count as a unit of a life and you think about someone as an animal. There are all kinds of peculiarities in these records too, that go both ways, which I think are interesting. So there's a reductive part, and then I've also seen inventories of animals where the animals are sort of being humanized, where the animals are being named, and so you actually have trouble sorting out, well, are these enslaved people or are these animals? And you can only tell based on the birth interval being different. And so there's this very slippery continuum in the way people are thinking about livestock. And then it's very messy until you get to these pre-formatted forms, and then it becomes very neat. And the last thing I would just say is this is obviously really uncomfortable to us. And I think it was also uncomfortable to them. Not all the time, but there are at least a few abolitionists who reflect on how accounting for people in the same way as animals is going to be damaging to people. So, sometimes we talk about dehumanizing and we are thinking about our own discomfort, but this is something that they were already uncomfortable with at the time.
What I appreciate actually a lot about both your and Jackie's work is that for those of you who don't know, there's a kind of canonical text by Witold Kula, Measures and Men, that kind of outlines this transition from pre-modern to modern measures. And I think both of your works actually really complicates this strict boundary that he makes between qualitative being pre-modern and quantitative being modern. Precisely in these particular cases, whether it's what is actually death, how are we counting that, and what is actually a slave, how does that fit into that? Because what he talks about is how mensuration emphasizes human relationships from land to land fertility. Anyway, so my point is that I like that these are examples that complicate that boundary. I want to turn to Jason as well, because you don't work on slave labor, but you do work on architectural labor. And so I want to bring some of the questions that you asked in the case of early modern France, how values of labor were understood and defined. in that particular, in this case, this is in a professionalizing an elite body. Can you, I know we've had conversations about the toisé, and I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And you can hear me, just to confirm? Yeah, just I suppose it kind of hits at the thing that you were just talking about distinguishing, I suppose, categories of either pre-modern or modern understandings of mensuration and the means by which the dialogue between qualitative and quantitative understandings of the world. In my work, one of the things I spend perhaps too much time thinking about, right, is I suppose about the kind of organization and the theoretical organization of the building practices and building laborers, right? And certainly for anyone who maybe has worked or has thought about early modern European, at least, labor, right? It's often understood about, a series of guild structures. Certainly the guild structures are kind of like the whipping boy for Diderot, et cetera, during the encyclopedia, and trying to kind of read logic through that. Through craft labor. One thing that's interesting, especially where mensuration kind of intersects, that I've thought about a lot, is the means by which certain measurement practices really around the kind of during the 17th and early 18th century start to become codified. The very definition of what constitutes in early modern France, which is called the toise, which was effectively kind of like the meter before the meter. It was the length of a man outstretched, which is effectively a meter, right? And a number of debates that unfold about what is this, what is the proper length of this? And certainly for anyone who certainly has, worked on the history of the meter, the relationship between mapping is quite clear in terms of kind of imperial understandings of the understanding of space. But one thing that I've thought a lot about is that a lot of these debates, when they first start to unfold, at least in the 17th century, are really about construction practices. The very understanding, right, that the Masonry Guild is effectively the guild that controlled much of the development of Paris at that time, or in the case of my research, and that the need to kind of understand and regulate urban space as a kind of space of the public, and a notion of the public that's coming into formation, becomes a kind of a flashpoint a bit. And really kind of like the definition of this now, it reminds me a little bit about what some of the other panelists spoke about Jackie and Caitlin, that what starts to emerge, certainly there's a kind of codification of this length that's negotiated through questions of the mechanical sciences. Jean Picard, a scientist in the Academy of Science, kind of tries to define it according to the swing of a pendulum. Among others, Christian Huygens is involved in this as well. But what happens in the profession of architecture is the codification of what's called the toisé, which was a means by which one measured building materials in terms of regulating its price and also regulating labor. And this becomes a really significant practice, although rather overlooked in architectural history and theory, for establishing the architectural profession as a kind of negotiator of labor, kind of between labor and the kind of universals that were espoused by the modern sciences of the time. So I think, one of the things in terms of, translating quantity into quality, I think one thing that's really important here, which the other speakers signaled in terms of the role of paperwork, is just the bureaucratic and legal dimension of it, right? That in this case, in my case, it's a kind of the nation state coming into being, and which comes with it on a more prosaic terms, just a lot of paperwork. The paperwork I look at is far less standardized in terms of like an empty form, but the sheer fact that there starts to emerge, just paperwork itself that seems to stand as some sort of legislative or bureaucratic fact, right? That the fact that it stands for something and is kind of housed bureaucratically either in the state, in the police force. In Paris, the police force is established around the same time, becomes really significant. So I think the notion either of bureaucracy, legality, municipality oversight, those sorts of things emerge as well.
Yeah, Jason, that's such a great point. And I love that you're bringing out the fact that quantification or the practices to quantify are tied and can be tied to processes of standardization that's associated with bureaucratic control, right? But they're not necessarily the same thing. They became aligned, but quantification and standardization don't necessarily have to be
right.
Connected.
And they're geographically specific often, right? That they're tied to a time and place.
Exactly. Jackie, yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just going to mention both in respect to what Jason and Caitlin were saying, that I think one of the things that's really fascinating is that however much paperwork purports to be clean and carefully controlled, it's a purports, right? Right. So part of what Jason is pointing to is the ways in which the bureaucracy wants its forms, right? But they're often messy and irregular, and and they didn't have to be the way that that we've ultimately received them now in the 21st century. I think one of the things that I wouldn't want people to walk away from this conversation with is a sense that we went from the mess of bodies to the cleanness of paperwork. That's not entirely true, right? Because the paperwork was never clean, right? Even the most like the texts that were foundational for the sciences of statistics and human population, the data is wildly unstandard, right? Even as it says, what I'm doing is giving a standard overview, everything is measured here, et cetera, right? And so there was a way in which even inside of individual texts, there wasn't clear, clean data in the way that we would think about it today. And in part, that's because, as I think Jason is pointing out, so much of this is responding to politics on the ground, right? Relationships on the ground, whether that's those of the slave trade, right? Or those of, Paris building guilds. It's often about political plays, right? Efforts to shore up who gets the authority, who gets the money, right? And Caitlin, I really, really love the point, right? That part of what happens in the slave trade is that the enslaved person gets written out of the negotiations, right? They no longer become the authority on their own body. I think that's a really excellent way of describing it. And I think many of these battles over how to map and how to measure that are part of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, they carry into today, right? So if we think about our modern moment, and trying to count COVID deaths, we are a messy patchwork, right? There is not a standard, even though I think people today often think, well, surely we're doing better than the 17th century. We're still fighting over like what counts as a death, what counts as the map, what counts as the body with authority. So I think these things they haven't been solved because they're not just about the technology, they're about the social relations that those technologies are embedded in.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Jackie. I'm good. Just before I continue, I want to remind people that if you have comments or questions, to please type them into the chat box. I just want to continue this conversation and pick up what you were saying, Jackie, because I think it connects a lot to what Ijlal writes on and works on. I think, you see the connection, but for me, your studies in modernism, right, and modern planning practices in the 20th century is so much about how these NGOs, these governments have these supposed categories that are grounded in data and numbers imposed upon, cities in the third world or in one case that you looked at in Pakistan. So I'm just curious about the ways in which these numbers are being used in the context that you've studied.
So here I was thinking, in the book as I wrote it, the argument kind of switched in the end that it's not through quantification in third world especially, and it's, development institutions, that structures of control or power are claimed, but through claims of quality, actually, by making certain qualitative claim that this, this population has this quality or this project has this quality, and somehow arguing that a certain kind of value can emerge just out of that imminently. I can refer to images and stuff, but just so that the audience were not, I'm sure Jason knows all these examples, but audience who are not familiar might be nice to see certain
Yes,
images.
please show us, please.
Can we pull them in, Eric? Or do I just click on? Oh, okay. No. And I'll go to the first one. We can go to this, or I can go to this. So I'm trying to formulate this relationship that architectural projects in the third world have been promoting a certain idea of quality, of sort of native quality, which is specifically to defer or hide a quantitative question, which is of colonial deficit, right? That the money, this amount of money was just simply taken out in resources, right? And the reading that I mean, in the bibliography that I suggested was, points to that. So one of the most important moments, or the moments that became famous, was when this Dutch architect, international architect Rem Koolhaas, who had been working on European cities in around 2000, went to Lagos, Nigeria, and rented or was given presidential helicopter to fly over the city. And he claimed that looking at, Lagos is this burgeoning city exploding with, slums, as they're called, and, deteriorating infrastructure. But he flew over this and said that actually all of these projects were at some point when the Nigerian state was rich with oil money, had started this big infrastructure project, but then were all left incomplete. So Koolhaas argues that actually that has created a certain stage of creativity and entrepreneurship. So even in traffic jams, we see people working out deals, finding new opportunities of cutting across, different trade zones and things there. So everything becomes an opportunity. And if you look at underpasses, people are recycling stuff from all over the world, and everything is being transformed. So Lagos and the citizen here, I mean, one person that you see, is a new subject of architecture is almost conjured, which is an entrepreneurial, critical subject who, if given the chance, or not even given the chance, that when it's just thrown into chaotic, breakdown of infrastructure, can rearrange with their own skills and ingenuity new value, right? So I try to argue that this actually is this is a qualitative claim which tries to cover over, and this is what I'm the reading that I was mentioning, a book by Subha Chakrabarti and Utsa Patnaik. The article is by Utsa Patnaik, who's a very famous Marxist economist at Jawaharlal Nehru University, came out from Columbia University and from Taluka Press, I think 2 years ago, and she maps to the cent that how British colonial government drained $45 trillion out of the Indian economy by using the taxes, which were simply just stored in English banks, and then using that money, taxes collecting from India, to buy Indian goods. Right, so it's kind of, I take your money and then I put it in my pocket and then use the same money to buy something from you. So it was sort of a short circuiting of the accounting. But this is a conservative claim because it doesn't even account for, if this money, the cumulative growth, if this money was simply invested back in India at the time, right? Now this is 17 times the current GDP of Great Britain. So even if you try to pay it back, you can't, right? And this was a crisis that was evident at the Bretton Woods conference, which was, after the war, all the colonial regimes and the new governing powers like the United States sat down around the table and figured out, okay, we have to figure out a new financial system because the colonial system has to go, right? And also they argued that the two wars the world was started precisely because certain European countries became too much in debt there was too much of a deficit, right? On one side, countries became in debt to other countries, and then they couldn't pay, and then and basically stepped out of the system and gave rise to national socialism and all that kind of. So we can't let this happen. So there has to be a new kind of international framework of check and balances. So no country goes too much into any other country's debt. So IMF, World Bank, all these institutions are World Bank primarily is set up as a means of checks and balance. So someone asks, okay, well, what's going to happen to Europe because you've just bombed it flat. So how is that market gonna work? So Marshall Plan becomes the thing where that for time in economic history, money is given for free. So it's a grant, like your money is given, there's nothing is owned. But that deficit in the third world, right? I mean, that's also standing. It cannot be folded into this accounting because it's just too large, right? $45 trillion just from Britain. So what development world is given is the idea of what the third world or decolonizing world is given is the idea of development. You see various theories emerging at this point, like Walter Rostow's famous, who was an advisor to Lyndon Johnson, that somehow if you line things up, things from traditional society, things will start to create this momentous effect, and development, economic development, they're talking about economic development, will just happen by itself. But architects step in with various theories, various qualitative arguments at this point to really cover over, which is essentially, I think, a quantitative question. It could be answered in this case very clearly in quantitative terms. Right? So this is Mekusha, who is the director of planning of French protectorate in Morocco. So he proposes housing for the migrants who are coming in Casablanca. And the logic is that first they come into these flats, low ground, single-story houses, but somehow acquire emergency is not in Providence. So. Sorry, I was hearing sirens. So that's all. So they'll first start in these low single-story houses, and somehow it will create these values in them, that modernizing values, and their incomes will increase, and slowly they'll move into these other high rises, right? So this is, how will that happen? We don't know, but then that becomes, architecture becomes this almost kind of where different, that when different quantifications don't line up, you put architecture in the middle, and somehow our translation happens, right? So this is Jacqueline Turvitt, urban planning secretary of this famous organization, SIAM, they all become UN experts and even, go on UN missions, most of the architects at this time. She goes to Gambia, and this is a funny one, that she's giving orders to make a plan of a small town, St. Mary, at the coast. But instead of looking at the statistics that the colonial government had collected, she says they're inadequate. Sets up teams of two like this, at four corners of the town, and asks them to count whatever is coming in, animals, bicycles, buses, coming in and out of town for 2 weeks. So I was just amazed at what kind of counting is this, right? And what does it generate? How can you randomly just put people on the side of the road? How do they know who's going and who's coming and who's staying, right? But there is a claim that through this kind of ad hoc, you can identify patterns. Patterns, the words are patterns, pressures, and it's the same language that Ramkulhas was using earlier, right? That by flying over Lagos, you can identify the patterns of, and somehow the patterns indicate where this thing is. And Kulos was 20 years ago, but there are still architectural firms going back. There was a more recent exhibition in MoMA by the firm Kunli Adime. It's a firm. He's also a student of Kulas from GST. NLE is the firm. So they also analyze that, given these patterns, we see that Lagos one day will somehow itself emerge, become, and it says here, WCP combines innovative patterns of Amsterdam and Venice, right? And he proposes this floating school in the most notorious floating informal settlement, Mokoko, that if you just provide them with these floating schools, the people then can manage, not only manage them, but will produce similar buildings, and the whole neighborhood transform into Venice. And actually took that model of the school to Venice in the Venice Biennale. While ironically the school was in the Venice Biennale, the actual school got destroyed by a storm. And the response of the firm was that when confronted about the state, this was in The Guardian, when confronted about the state of the floating school, NLE replied that it was the responsibility of the community to maintain the school, not man. Right? So here, I'll end here. How do I end my slideshow?
Ishlad, one thing that I think what you're talking about, I think relates very well to what Jason was saying, which that Jason is at the beginning of this history, when architecture really starts to form itself as a unbiased, objective, right, practice, a body whose formation is about mediating between different discourses, different groups of people, right? And so in some ways, I think that your history that you've kind of outlined connects really well to an earlier history that Jason was referring to as well. And I think it actually is a good segue into our next prompt, which is about exactly the politics of neutrality, right? So how, so in your case, you're talking about how architecture positions itself as a neutral body between all of these other, whether you're talking about the population in this particular country and site, through economists, such as in the World Bank, et cetera. But let's broaden this question a little bit about how does quantification, mensuration, mapping, it is aligned to values of objectivity, right? Neutrality. Why? I know and so then, how are the forms and practices of measurement really intimately tied? And I think you were getting at this, right? To institutions and professional bodies that are shaped by the very politics that they seek to disavow, right? And I think that this goes into a lot of the topics that we've covered, but I want to talk specifically about neutrality, and I want to ask Anne, because your work is so much about this. The arc of your work has really centrally asked these questions in historical terms, and now in Canada's colonial settlements. So how do maps, in your case, geography, unify in this unified composition, geometric composition, let's say, right, relate to these practices of neutrality or objectivity? Oh, Anne, you have to turn on your mic.
I think it is on.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, I think it is on. Yep. The very simple answer to that is they lie. The very simple one. And I think in a way we have to go back to sort of really basic concepts. And I think within the context of indigeneity in Canada, the real issue, the crux of the issue, is land, or if you like, private property, as the Europeans would describe it, Euro-Canadians with that whole tradition of governance would describe it. And for Indigenous people, land means something completely different, and private property doesn't exist as such, right? So if you go back to the concept of property, from its very beginning, the idea of property as thing, rather than as property as a complex series of social relations, was established really in the 17th century with John Locke. You say, well, that's interesting. That's probably unpolitical, but it was totally political. And in fact, if you read John Locke on property, there's no question that he was thinking about colonialism and its justifications when he spoke of the value and rights that come from labor. Okay, when he was talking about that, and he says that there cannot be a clearer demonstration of anything than several nations of the Americans who are rich in land and poor in the comforts of life. God in his reason commanded him, man, to subdue the earth, to improve it for the benefit of life, and therein lay out something upon it that was his own, his labor. Okay, and he that in obedience to his command of God subdued and tilled and sowed any part of it, thereby annexed to it something that was his property, which another has not the title to, nor could without injury take from him. So this was then a whole rationale for the dispossession of all of the indigenous people of certainly of Canada, almost all, because there's very, very little agricultural, there was some, very little agricultural development that the Europeans would recognize. Nor was this appropriation of any parcel of land by improving it any prejudice to any other land, since there was still enough and as good as was left, and more than yet unprovided could use. All right, so this is the rationale. So this is the rationale for massive dispossession, and it plays out. It plays out politically in mapping, in topographic mapping, particularly from the 18th century, late 18th century on. And in cadastral mapping, which is mapping right down to the individual property, and so it is a very, so the mapping in this sense is grounded in concepts that become sort of indisputable. You couldn't argue against. I mean, what is there but private property? It doesn't make any sense to talk about communal property. It doesn't make any sense to talk about systems of land ownership that are other than this. And so, in a sense, the indigenous becomes nonsensical. It becomes incomprehensible. It becomes outside of law. It becomes outside of governance. It becomes beyond the pale, right? And then how do indigenous people deal with that? I mean, we can see examples of the lyingness of it, the lyingness of it in all sorts of maps. Well, sorry. I showed you. I sent you the image of the topographic mapping of Egypt, where they showed individual property lines. If you look in closely at it, you'll see that there are little fields, all sorts of fields depicted in here, which suggests, we know this land. We know this land. We can claim this land. This is our land. How do we? Our control over it makes us the all powerful. And I'll come back to that third image in a minute. So it's a lie, because they had no idea where the properties were, the property lines were. They had none of that kind of understanding at all. So it's if you like, it's a convention, but it's also a lie, and a lie that is being very carefully argued against by Egyptian and other Arabic speaking scholars who look at this and can pull this out now, as Europe couldn't. So that pushes indigenous people very much to the margin, so that any type of arguing against this kind of system feels almost impossible. And that is compounded by all sorts of other ideologies, such as that any gender problems or any gender disparities within indigenous communities are formed by and come out of, any gender violence comes out of the indigenous society. It is not something that anybody else has anything to do with, and so on. Lots of sort of prejudicial ways of thinking that solidify the dominance of the state and of continuing colonial things. How do indigenous people fight against it? They do. And they are increasingly doing so now with increasingly good effect. So one of the very, very important ways is by getting into the Canadian legal system and understanding the Canadian legal system, understanding statistics and numbers and how they're wielded, and beginning to try to subvert them. So if you show that last image there, this is from the Delgmuck trial, where in fact indigenous people came in, and it was I'll just have to double check that. Anyway, the indigenous people came to this court case, which was about a huge stretch of land that had been taken over. It was all of the land in British Columbia was unceded. In other words, indigenous people never gave it up. And so now it is very much a matter of law. And indigenous people, for the first time in the 1990s, came to court and asked the court for permission to express their knowledge of land and their experience of land in the language of the court, in the language of maps particularly. And so they took these topographic maps from which they had been erased, and with the work of, with the help of some key anthropologists, drew on the map their land use, their land experience, their history, and their knowledge. And this is a beautiful cartoon because it shows, this highly skeptical judge with all of the books and the maps behind him, and indigenous land explanation being done verbally, much more, well, in fact, being done verbally, although drawing on the maps. And so this began to overturn the very comfortable Canadian sense of dominating the land. So property now in Canada, as a result of this kind of case, I picked on the 1995, but you could go back to 1970. This kind of case, Canada has 11% private land, private property, only 11%. 48% is provincial property, and 41% is federal, so crown land. 0.2% of land is reserve land in Canada, 0.2%. However, how much land has been able to be negotiated in recent years into some manner of ownership by Indigenous nations, pulling from both Crown land and from federal land, maybe 35% of land in Canada. So there has been essentially repoliticizing the settlers' tools, the colonial tools, recognizing the politics of them, and then reusing them has been an enormously important movement in Canada in the 21st century and in also the latter part of the 20th century. I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but
no, this is fantastic. Just to go back to a point, this image that you show of to me, this demonstrates such the power of a map. It's so encompassing. As you were saying, it seems like there's no outside to this logic here. And even though it's totally untrue, there's this way in which it's so engrossing and consuming for anyone who views this. And this was a system that was imposed upon the entire world, right? Not just Egypt, but entire world. And so I want to turn to now Bernie and talk about this other system that we're living with. And it's another kind of regime that undergirds so much of how we navigate our world and the media that navigate. It undergirds so many different ways in which we even experience the world. So can you talk a little bit about your work related to that, this particular tool, the forms that it's taking?
Sure. Can you just repeat the last bit of the question? You got cut off for a moment.
Oh, I think I was just saying, can you just talk a little bit about the tool, the forms, the politics that undergird it?
Sure. So, in my work on things like GPS, digital imaging, digital space, I've been interested in something that is very similar to what Anne was talking about when she had this idea of, how it is that concepts become solidified and neutral and incontestable, right? I'm sort of interested in how it is that all complex modes of everyday practices get stabilized into these seemingly black box technical decisions that we call computing. And one of the things that interests me about, for example, GPS or digital images is that one talks about this idea of rendering, right? That space is rendered, that data is rendered. And the word rendering is it's a very interesting word. When we talk about it in other contexts, say a judge rendering a decision or a prisoner being rendered, we have this sense that rendering involves a kind of decision. It involves a certain expert coming in and adjudicating an affair. But, there's still some sort of decision. When we give something like rendering over to data, over to databases, over to computing, it's much easier to forget the kind of complex histories of the sort Caitlin and Jackie and everyone else has talked about, that go into stabilizing these numbers to produce certain types of space. So in thinking about, for example, GPS, how is it that we developed a certain type of standard, global, apparently uniform space? I've been interested a little bit in this idea of, when Benjamin talks about mechanical images, he talks about the tactish, the tactical, but also kind of the tactile, right? The way in which an image is produced has a strategic function. And then, I think if you can start kind of unpacking the tactility that is totally lost in this world of digital data, maybe there's a way you can start constructing the history of it. So to pick one little image that I pulled up, or that I brought with me, we have, for example, this is an image that was used to train radar operators in the 1940s, and to test if radar operators would be adequately qualified to scrutinize these images. And so, radar is very important. It's the source where you first start getting digital graphics, digital or electronic graphics that become digital interfaces, and a new way of mapping space in real time discrete elements that can be sorted by machines. And even before you have machines that can totally break down space into these, flexible, calculable units, you have this effort to train soldiers to work with images in a new way, to not think of images in terms of, for example, lines, to not think of images in terms of expanses, but rather to be able to identify, in this particular image, you have a set of coordinates in the top left and the top right, and then you have a box in the middle that is in all these discrete units. And the question is, how quickly can you figure out what letter corresponds to the 1 or the 2 or the 3 or the 4 or the 5? And if you go throughout the, how do I make the images go away? Go back to the overall picture of me. If you go back to something like the rise of GPS, the rise of GPS and digital mapping really comes out of, for example, wartime projects to take massive public spaces to make them computable, and then to have soldiers, for example, working in private individual rooms where they operate in small bits on the individual data bits. And you cultivate ways of seeing, ways of touching, ways of interacting with that information that all get, in a way, baked into rendering processes, rendering of visual graphics, but also something like the sheer speed at which one can assign and locate points on a planet, according to something like GPS, is closer related to the speed and problematics of things like modern warfare and modern ballistics. And so, this notion of the kind of neutrality of numbers, the neutrality of all this data, I think that neutrality is, it's, among other things, it's a way of diffusing and making disappear these tactical histories, these political histories. And, as Jackie was saying, as I think in a different way Caitlin was saying, when one can start recovering the bodies, when one can start recovering the operations that allow this disassembly of the world into discrete bits, one can also start finding the politics and the decisions that got built into these data sets, let's call them. It's
an earlier history to that, Bernie, that you're talking about are the first aerial photographs that were taken from the plane. And at least in France, that was the French military was really the first in developing this. They flew over their newly acquired colonial sites during the French Mandate, and they were so gung-ho about using these aerial photographs because they were so much more accurate, they were so much more objective. But in fact, the resolution of these images was so poor when they were developed, they actually needed a whole bureaucracy of interpreters to even understand what this image was, this supposed objective, clear, accurate, precise image was showing them, right? And this would, of course, drive then all these air bombing campaigns, these images. So there's such a long history to these practices of mapping and quantification tied to the military, which of course Anne knows very well. One thing I wanted to quickly connect to was there's another profession that also uses the term rendering, which is architecture, right? It's a central, I'm just curious what you guys think of the architectural historians who are in the room, what this idea of rendering means for you. Especially given, like what you were saying about how architecture really becomes this mediating role for so many different institutional bodies that are managing these cities and spaces.
So, I mean, I'm very intrigued by, Bernice, your comment about rendering as a judgment, right? So in the end, the judgment is no matter how much data you collect, the judge renders rendering is the moment where quantification turns into a qualitative judgment, right? I mean, there's ethics and morals, but it's the whole Kantian, judgment. You have to make how do you get out of the bias and what a priori, right? So architecture is kind of, I feel like, rendering in the sense that it claims is doing this all on quality, but what it's sneaking in is these different kind of qualitative judgments, right? And really, in many cases, hiding that it doesn't have even the quantitative justification, the regimes of quantification behind it. Sometimes it just assumes, because in development theater, I was very intrigued that architecture comes in to sustain or undergird claims, which then can be used by other disciplines to build their own bigger quantification regime. So, economists would say, okay, these are the numbers that we have. Then architecture would say, okay, if we make that many houses, that many this will produce these kind of psychological effects, right? So how does number to psychology happens, right? This claim that somehow living in this house will improve your outlook in this way. It just gets absorbed in, the translation between the two. Somehow space, time, aesthetics, these kind of things render making those jumps possible. And then the sociologists would come in and say, yes, this is happening and this would happen and then predict the future. So yeah, rendering becomes, I see in architecture that kind of qualitative judgment, trying to, or what perhaps Lyotard would call differand, right? To making two discourses which otherwise would not be equal to each other. It somehow comes in and becomes this thing which allows these two discourses, space and psychology to be linked together, right? And be set in a comparative format, a causal relationship.
Yeah, Anne, please. And then Caitlin and Jason.
Sorry?
Anne, Caitlin, and then Jason.
Great. Mine's a very simple point. I tend to think about rendering as in the kitchen. And what you're doing is you're applying a significant amount of force, as in heat, to a substance to transform it into something that you can use. And in a way, that's what it is, right?
I too was thinking about extraction of fat, though I was thinking about it historically about what do we get out of all these animals is we render their fat to make fuel. But the other thing I was thinking about is, when Anne put up that picture that's so, of all the picture of the lie, right? And then I spend a lot of time working with economic historians, and I don't know about that map per se, but I know about many other similar maps full of lies, as you call them so clearly. And the economist hires an RA, and the RA matches that up to Google Maps, and then they go along clicking all of the lines and turning them into spaces that are even more abstract and where the lie is even much, much harder to see. And what are we doing with these historical examples? I think is hopefully we're training people to see the lies. Or to see the politics, because we're pushing against a set of uses for these data where people are doing the exact opposite. Like they're trying, whether conscious or not, they're trying to erase our access to the context and to the lies and to pretend that there aren't any politics there. Right. So what can we get from going back to the original map is you see the lie, but then the problem is that the person who's using that data that's been, rolled up through this bureaucracy through, from an undergraduate who's clicked along the lines but doesn't know anything about the politics is you get a kind of now I'm just mashing everything together, but you get this data as a kind of rendered resource that is completely detached from the thing it's been taken from. And I think of, there's a paper from an economist who I admire about barbed wire in the US West. And the paper is about how he uses barbed wire as an instrument for private property. And he shows that, the arrival of barbed wire meant property was secure and therefore we get growth. And there's no mention of expropriation of land. Like, barbed wire makes expropriation of land effective. So maybe actually it's expropriation of land that creates this thing called growth. Anyway, thank you so much.
Jason, you had a comment.
But I'll try to keep it super brief. Just on the topic of rendering, I mean, I think if you just think of architectural rendering, just to be like completely simplistic, right? There's a clear sensual and evocative dimension of that. And I think that certainly raises the question, right, of measurement and the standardization. And I maybe don't mean standardization, but the kind of regulation of information that's conveyed through drawing, right? Like, how do those things relate to each other when they're placed perhaps in tension? I think one of the interesting things certainly about measurement, especially in architecture and cartography, et cetera, is that certainly it relies on a kind of contractual understanding of, right, like the measurement units have to be the same for both audiences reading it for it actually to kind of make sense. And to what degree, right, does a rendering or an evocative or kind of an image that has a sensual component of that, like how is that negotiated? Or I think that's an interesting question, right? Certainly you would see, the degree to which would you see a kind of rendered architectural drawing if it was for construction purposes, right? Like, probably not, but why is that not so, right? Like in architectural drawings, like how do you kind of describe, this would certainly be something you would see in early modern material between architectural drawings, how do they describe it? Like whether they use like kind of classical vocabulary or do they make recourse to geometric terms that seem to have that's understood more across different populations, whoever that might be. Maybe.
Yeah, Jackie, please.
Yeah.
Building off of what Jason was saying, I think there's something important to attend to in the aesthetics, right? And Caitlin, I really love what you did with rendering, right? Going from the cooking and the sort of like extracting, abstracting down. I think there's something about the final product, right? When it's meant to tell the lie, using Anne's terms, it's often exceptionally beautiful, right? I think about the maps and how ornate and colored and decorative they are. And Jason, thinking about your discussion of like an architectural rendering and how that's not necessarily what the builders are going to use. It's often used to sell an idea, right? And I'm way outside my disciplinary zone there, but that's my sense of things, right? Is that the beautiful picture is meant to help the pitch, right? To get the thing done. And I wonder, I'm going to spend some time thinking about the tactility of data comment that you made, Bernard, in part because I've been thinking about visceralization of data. But I think there's something about those maps that and the renderings, right, that are offering a kind of aesthetics that are designed to sell the lie, and that's a really important feature, right? That they embody their own kind of artistic labor. And that labor is often effacing the labor of quantification in order to produce this highly aestheticized, coveted object.
Mm-hmm. So just if I could interject before we move to Iqbal, and I think the third prompt was about trust, and authority. Why do we trust these numbers? And I think we're actually answering that question. They're seductive, right? The aesthetic element of how they recruit us into believing them, right? So I just want to throw that topic into the discussion that's happening now. This question of trust. But Ijlal, you had your hand up, so I want to make sure we get to you.
I was just thinking, trying to think. On one hand, when Jason, you were mentioning the renderings, that why can't builders use it, right? So the thought that came to my mind, and now Jacqueline, you've complicated it, but the initial idea that came to my mind was, well, that's because it's almost the knowledge is taken out of the body, right? So it is the increasing quantification of building processes is to take the knowledge out. The embodied knowledge is no longer recognized, right? So there were other building traditions. I mean, the British were confused when they landed in India. Where's the architect, right? Because the architect status was not like this person who designs. It was just a notational system that you hand to the artisans or craft people who know how to, what this means and what the transition would be. And if you ask them to describe it, they probably can't, mathematically draw it or geometrically, but their hand or body knows through various how to these materials come together, right? So it's a notational system which instructs the artisan to invoke the knowledge in the body itself. But they used it, the British archaeologists used it again as an evidence that these artisans don't intellectually understand the principles of their own knowledge. So therefore, if we draw maps and put geometry on it, we are extracting something which is in unconscious knowledge, and therefore we can copyright it, and this becomes our ownership, right? So the principle, it's a complex way of erasing the body slowly, and bodily forms of knowledge, which is also erasing of indigenous knowledge, as Anne was saying, right? Out of the representation, right? Whether it's technical or aestheticized, as you were saying.
Yeah, Anne.
Yeah, I love everything that's been said there. It's fascinating, all of it. I just want to remind you that in addition to the disembodied knowledge that is being created, and that is highly aesthetic, absolutely true. There are other mechanisms going on in the background and maybe even the foreground. One of those, I tend to think of these different realms: the legal realm and the, if you like, the scientific technocratic realm, and then there's also the realm of education. And it's really, really important to look at what is happening in education, not so much on the lines of technocratic or scientific, but in fact the concepts, going back to concepts like the concept of property or different ways of looking at property, the unthinkableness of various concepts, that unthinkableness is essentially created through education. So that for what we've seen in our project is that there are concepts that young people coming out of 4 years of university and all of the stuff that went on before, that they cannot find the words to talk about some really important things. Like, for example, if you like, indigenous sovereignty. That is an unthinkable thought for actually very well-educated students. If you ask them, what do you think of indigenous sovereignty? They can't answer. They don't have the language. They don't have the, so you start digging into this. If you actually start going back into it and looking at what happened in what text and what curriculum, you can start to identify where a thought is being made unthinkable, including the embodied thought, embodied language, the importance of place. Place is conceived as a series of complex relationships, right? Are made unthinkable in education.
And I love how that is a reminder of what our jobs at these universities are. So it's not just about our authority as a legal authority or the authority of economists determine our values, but we also have a role in this as authorities in education. I just want to pause here a little bit and ask, again, if there are any comments or questions from anybody in the audience, please don't be shy. You can see that we're all relatively friendly. So, please feel free to ask your question or to comment. But I also, Caitlin, did you have your hand up?
Sorry, I did, but no, please go ahead. Anyone else?
No.
I was just thinking, turning back to question of trust, right? Two problems, it seems, what Anne is mentioning. One is that we don't have epistemologies or knowledge systems of continuity, right? In which actually stolen land and stolen can be imagined as a burden for the current government or the current nation state, or that those histories if you think of history in terms of colonialism, then decolonization, and then nation state, these are all epistemologies of discontinuities, right? So we keep in this. There's no way to think of returning to how a debt owed by previous generations to think of generational debt, right? What does that mean? So we don't really, certain questions really, the education doesn't allow us to think that way. Political system don't allow us to think that way. The other thing that I was struggling with, okay, so if we figure out some way of connecting things back, and to Caitlin's point of that how the body gets erased, right, with increasing stabilization of numbers in some way, would that body, in which form can that body be brought back? Or would it also be just brought back as an artifice, as into a new mold, which is just as easily pushed through, right? Is aestheticized, right? So it's not like if you recover the body, it is the indigenous body or is the slave's body, right? So it is not. And there is what I was trying to do in my presentation was to show that there is an increasingly trend towards evoking quality. And there are all these bodies which are being pulled from the third world as, creative, and this, and the village women are creative, and everyone, all they just need is just a chance and micro credit loan and all that. But these are all excluding, really erasing the historical constraints that are around those bodies, right? And to just isolating them in this space, which is unrestrained. So how do we create a continuity, bring that indigenous body, but also recognize the constraints that because it has passed through time, it has not just remained there in that erosion and its visibility again, it emerges in constraints. So its capability now, Gayatri Spivak has famously said that it's actually, we think whenever we say that poor people, it's not elitist to say that actually most of the world's population is not creative. Right? We shy away from that claim that no, everyone is inherently creative. No. If you've taken 200 years to erase creativity or not give opportunities of creative thinking to vast swaths of world population, you cannot on the dime ask them to be creative. You have to do the long work of creating creativity again, right? So where is that law? How do we bring the body back? How do you bring indigenous knowledge back? How do you bring embodied knowledge back while acknowledging the constraints?
Jackie, please. Yeah.
I love that question or series of questions. Thank you so much for them. And as you were asking them, I was thinking about, we do have the body back under the regime of quantification, right? We have quantified self, and this idea that what we need to do is to enumerate the various activities of the body in order to be able to say anything authoritative about them, right? And one of the things that I think about a lot when I write about that work is that very often the individual is alienated from their own experience, right? And told that what they need to take to a physician or some other person is numbers to prove the authenticity of their experience. And I feel really conflicted about this. On the one hand, I don't want bodies to just become the new terrain that we map with numbers, right? That's not what I want. At the same time, I'm mindful of how for, say, in the Data for Black Lives movement, right? Yeshi Milner talks about how data is a powerful agent for social change, right? Especially for Black women, but also for other people, right, in oppressed conditions or who are rendered non-authoritative vis-a-vis others, right? Often what they can do is use those numbers to speak back. And I think that's part of what Anne was talking about with the discussion of drawing on the maps. And so I think I would love to see a sort of transnational research agenda that thought about what does it mean to bring back the conditions under which we don't have to enumerate everything, but also how can we enumerate in ways that speak back, right? What would a city look like if it were built not on the basis of quantification, but on something else? I don't know, but I'm super into speculative thinking.
Bernie.
Yeah, I just wanted to add briefly. I think, so I wish there was some, part of me would like to return to some pre-rendered world and feels like, of course, it's probably not really there. But I do think, the rise of things like critical data studies, which, you know, Jackie, among others here, are associated with, is sort of interesting as a promise of like multiplications of rendering possibilities, right? So rendering, it seems among, you know, rendering is, it's, you know, rendering has something to do with like authority, the legitimation of a certain set of techniques for producing some kind of a knowledge practice. And I think it may be that, you know, somehow then when we talk about the work of education, so for example, I work in digital humanities, but I'm just as taken by things like comparative literature. You know, working with students, working with the public to think about what are different ways that people can access the data available to them, access the experience to them, and then to find ways to put it forth and to disseminate it, you know, with a mixture of new forms of rendering. And also, though, we have to probably give people some set of broadly conceived technical expertise and skills so that their renderings circulate with some authority. And I mean, I think that's a very, very long project. I mean, the example, though, of the courtroom was a fascinating example of that rendering taking place in the way that you really have a new representation, a new form of knowledge, and a space for it to get some kind of legitimation.
Jason, please.
Yeah, I was thinking just in a lot of these conversations, right, about trust and about mensuration and also about rendering. I was thinking of a book I was reading. It's not new. It's about 20 years old, but it's by Barbara Shapiro. It's called The Culture of Fact, right, and talks a lot about like, you know, tying early modern English travel and colonization and tying that, you know, the coming across new lands served to destabilize longstanding understandings or longstanding references, right, either to mythology, biblical references, etc. And through this emerges, you know, the authority of science, the authority of cartography in terms of presenting some kind of notion of a fact, right? Like that some sort of kind of cultural understanding of a fact emerges, right? And one thing I'm thinking about, especially during the course of this conversation, right, is that does a fact still need to be tied to numbers? Or when we talk about mensuration now and questions of quantification, is the notion that it's factual, is that still relevant, or does that still hold the same form of authority? When you talk about renderings, right, like I've been thinking a little bit about the degree to which rendering actually, how does that relate to kind of factual information? Like, is it the same? Is it that it makes it legible? I mean, going back to what Jackie was saying in terms of the kind of aesthetics or the commerciability of rendering, it made me think about that a little bit. And just to bring it into our current, some current cultural scenarios. I mean, we talked about COVID obliquely, I suppose, but there's a very beautiful article from last spring by the art historian Sarah Lewis in the New York Times that talks about that a lot of their early information on COVID relied on data, but didn't rely on visual imagery or photography, and what that actually means about our own engagement with things like mortality, but also in terms of how it starts to be registered more broadly across society. All sorts of things that made sense in my mind. I'm not sure if they came out right.
Well, okay, I just want to say that we're officially at 8 o'clock, at least in my time. So we've been talking for over an hour and a half. I think we could go on for several more hours. It's been so much fun. I just want to give the panelists any last thoughts that you might have on these topics before I close the session. Bernie, yes, and then Caitlin.
I just wanted to say briefly, because we jumped so fast into it and these electronic forms are a little unusual. I wanted, of course, to thank Min for inviting us, for organizing us. Finally, I get to meet and talk to people that I would have never had a chance to meet otherwise. And then also just thank the hosts and the patrons for making this event possible. It's really, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you guys. Caitlin.
A way that thank you for experimenting with a way that is letting us connect with each other rather than just speaking into the black boxes we're so often doing. I guess I did my closing thought is, if you I make lots of presentations about accounting and slavery. And an exceptionally common response I get from audiences is, oh, just look at the violence of numbers. And there's some truth in that, but I also feel like that's like such a fundamentally misguided take that doesn't see that the problem is about power and slavery and that it's people doing the violence, not the numbers. And so I have this kind of strong belief that we need to, the problem with numbers is not numbers themselves. They're useful, but just as any kind of storytelling or any kind of reporting or gathering of information is. And what we need is those numbers in more hands, and then also more recognition that numbers are more similar to other kinds of storytelling. And we realize they're always erasing some things and making others visible. And so I suppose this really fits with what Jackie was just saying about, well, what do we need to put these tools into multiple hands? And same as what kind of Bernie was adding about how do you give people the ability to have the power that numbers creates and also question it.
Before there's one question that just came up and I want to read it out because let me see if I can read it. It's from someone named Alex Becker. Thanks for the enlightened discussion, perhaps. Well, okay, sorry for the preface. Okay, to build on Jackie's point on quantification, I guess, or I don't know what the Q stands for. And the body as a new terrain for numeration and datafication. How do you see the injection of sensing and automated technologies into the rendering of mapped public space? We are aware of computers reproducing and cementing past biases and follies. Where do you see the harshest issues here? Are there, in your view, any possibility for an emancipatory or emancipating such developments, thinking contemporary techno-optimism, Brenton's, the stack, etc.? Some of that I don't even, but I think, yeah, Jackie, please.
I can try, because I think it's a good question, and it in some ways speaks to some of the threads that we're sort of pulling together here at the end. Right, that part of what we need is not to be mad at numbers per se, right, but to recognize their non-authoritativeness and their creativity, but also their limitedness, right? And so I think, Jason, you were just talking about we had data, but we didn't have the images. And I actually think that's an intensely powerful distancing strategy, right, that allows people to cope with mass quantities of death. And I think it's actually been an extraordinary disservice in the sort of Anglophone sphere to see it play out that way, that we don't see mortality like the actual bodies. I think at the same time, part of Caitlin's suggestion, right, is that we need to think of this as one tool, not the only tool. And so to speak to the question that you read, Min, I think the problem with automation is that it makes the approach singular rather than multiple, right? If we were able to multiply the storytelling modes and technologies, maybe that would be great. But I think when what we do is hand over that storytelling, that map making, that counting to computational processes, we almost always choose a much smaller sphere. And that, I think, would actually be going in the wrong direction if what we think we need is more recognition of more kinds of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. So speaking on this topic, tomorrow we have a counter mapping workshop with two people who have been working in mapping and quantification. One of them is Juan Salgado. I don't know, I'm butchering his last name. Who is going to present on the project Conflict, Urbanism in Bogota. And we'll also have an art historian, Dana Bird, who's going to be talking about the mapping of the counter mapping of slave plantations. So that's tomorrow at 6:30. And if you're interested in that, please email me or Anna Louise Milne, who's the director of ULIP. And I just want to make an announcement for the second part of this ongoing conversation about the quantification of urban space, which is on May 25. And the topic is going to be speculation and mismeasures. And we'll talk more actually about many of the issues that have been raised, especially property and all of the ways in which those numbers don't really work, right? Well, thank you so much to the audience for listening. And most of all, thank you so much for participating. The panelists, you guys are great. Your work is great. And I encourage all of you to look on the website for the citation to their work and some of the works that have been mentioned in this conversation. Okay.
Thank you, Min. Thank you, everybody.